Okay, so are you ready to dive into this? We're going to be looking at learning how to learn, and you've sent over a ton of research on this. And, it turns out we've been doing it all wrong, haven't we?
It's true, yeah. Our intuition about learning can really kind of lead us astray. Um, we tend to think that our brains are these kind of perfect recording devices, just soaking up all the information effortlessly.
Yeah, like if we stare at our notes long enough, it'll all just sink in, right?
Right, exactly. But the research really paints a different picture. Learning isn't about passively absorbing information, it's about actively engaging with it. And that brings us to this really interesting concept called desirable difficulties.
Desirable difficulty. So you're saying we should be making things harder for ourselves. That seems counterintuitive.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Because who wants to make things more difficult?
Yeah.
But introducing certain difficulties into the learning process can actually make it stick better in the long run. Think about it this way. You wouldn't want a pilot who aced a multiple choice test to be the one flying your plane, would you?
Or a brain surgeon, for that matter. I mean, they can't just be memorizing a textbook. They need to know how to use that information in these really high-pressure situations.
Absolutely. And that's where these desirable difficulties come in. By challenging ourselves to retrieve information, make connections, apply what we've learned in different contexts, we're actually strengthening those neural pathways.
So it sounds like maybe we should be looking at it as kind of like how we build a muscle. We're not just going to sort of look at weights all day and magically get stronger. We've got to actually do the work. So when it comes to learning, what's actually going on in our brains when we're trying to learn something new?
So you can almost imagine it as a three-step process. First, there's encoding, which is where your brain takes in that new information.
Okay, encoding, got it. So that's when we're first exposed to the material.
Right. Then comes consolidation, where that new information gets connected to your existing knowledge and starts to form a more permanent memory.
So it's like we're weaving the new facts into what we already know. It's all about making those connections.
Exactly. A perfect way to put it. And then finally, we have retrieval. That's the ability to actually pull that information out of our brains when we need it.
Retrieval, that's the moment of truth. So how do we make sure that we can actually retrieve the information?
This is where it gets really interesting. The research is showing that the more effortful the retrieval, the stronger that learning is going to be.
So basically what you're saying is I should have been quizzing myself all along. I feel like I've been kind of cheating and just telling myself that, oh yeah, rereading my notes is good enough, right?
We've all been there. But think about it this way. Rereading your notes, that might create the illusion of knowing, but it's not forcing your brain to actually do the work of recalling the information. It's like the difference between maybe looking at a map and actually navigating a new city. You got to get in there and experience it. And that's what retrieval practice is doing for our brains.
Yeah, you got to put in the work. You got to get in there and get lost a few times, right? Okay, so we need to challenge ourselves, make those connections, basically be more active in the whole learning process.
Right. And the more effort we put into that process, the stronger the learning becomes. And that brings us to this really fascinating study that was done at Columbia Middle School.
Oh, yeah. They were experimenting with retrieval practice in a real classroom setting. I remember reading about this one.
Exactly. And the results are pretty remarkable. What they found is that simply quizzing students regularly, even on small, bite-sized chunks of information, significantly boosted their long-term retention.
You're saying that just being quizzed more helped these middle schoolers remember information long term. And we're not talking about college students here. This is huge for anyone.
That's what's so compelling about this study. It highlights just how powerful retrieval practice can be, regardless of age or really anyone's background.
So walk me through this. How did they actually do it? Did they quiz these kids every single day?
Well, they divided the students into two groups. One group was given these frequent low-stakes quizzes throughout the semester, and then the other group just followed the kind of typical classroom routine lectures, then a big test at the end of each chapter.
I'm going to guess that the group that was quizzed more often did a little better, huh?
You got it. The students who were quizzed regularly, they ended up scoring significantly higher on their final exams, even months later.
Wow, so it wasn't just a short-term boost, it actually stuck with them. They remembered it. That's incredible. But why does this work so well?
Because retrieval practice isn't just about testing what you know. It's actually about strengthening the connections in your brain. The harder your brain has to work to recall something, the more deeply it gets encoded.
So basically, use it or lose it applies to our brains just as much as our muscles.
Exactly. And that kind of brings us to another fascinating piece of effective learning, is how we structure our practice.
So we've got this active recall thing down, but how we structure our practice also matters. You mentioned like a power trio earlier, spacing, interleaving, variation. Break down those three for me, because they sound like they could be real game changers when it comes to learning.
Absolutely, and they all play, a very crucial role in making that learning stick. Let's start with spacing. This is probably the most intuitive one. It's the idea that spreading out your study sessions over time, rather than cramming everything in at the last minute, is far more effective for long-term retention.
So no more all-nighters. Spacing things out gives your brain that time to process everything. I get it.
Exactly. It's like, giving your brain time to breathe between those workouts, right? You wouldn't want to run a marathon without any training. You got to build up those mental muscles.
Okay, that makes total sense. Now, interleaving this one sounds a little trickier, right?
Yeah.
How does that work exactly?
Interleaving is about mixing things up. So instead of studying one topic, one skill until you feel like you've mastered it, you alternate between different subjects, different concepts during those practice sessions.
So instead of just going all in on, say, history for an hour, I might do 20 minutes of history, then switch to math, then maybe some, I don't know, French vocab, then back to history.
Precisely. And it might feel a little messy, a little less efficient on the surface, but research shows that kind of mixed practice actually leads to much stronger learning in the long run. And there's a fascinating study they did with the Cal Poly baseball team that really highlights this.
Oh, this is the one where they were experimenting with different pitching routines, right?
That's the one. They wanted to see what kind of practice would help the players hit better, right? So they had some players practice hitting the same pitch over and over, while others practiced with, a mix of pitches like fastballs, curveballs, changeups. Everything was all mixed up.
So one group was totally predictable. The other group, they never knew what was coming next.
Exactly. And what they found is that during the practice, the players who practiced with that mix, they felt less confident, they were striking out more, it felt messier. But here's the thing, when it came to the games, those players who practiced with the mixed pitches, they actually outperformed the other players.
Wow. So even though it felt harder, maybe even less productive, the mixed practice got them better results. How does that work?
Well, it all comes down to how our brains actually make connections, how they learn to tell the difference between different things. When you're constantly having to shift gears to move your attention from one thing to the next, your brain have to work harder to retrieve that information and figure out how to use it.
It's like we're training our brains to be more adaptable, more flexible.
Exactly, and that's such a crucial skill.
Absolutely. So we've covered spacing, we've covered interleaving. Now what about variation? Where does that fit into all of this?
Variation is all about approaching the same concept from different angles. Using different methods, trying different approaches, cross-training for your brain, if you will. Think about someone learning a new language. They might benefit from reading, writing, listening, and speaking, right? All different ways of engaging with that same material.
So don't get stuck in a rut. Be open to experimenting.
Exactly. And this reminds me of Bonnie Blodgett, the blundering gardener. She's a fantastic example of someone who really embraces variation and this idea of learning through trial and error.
I've heard of her. She's all about getting your hands dirty, making the mistakes, figuring things out as you go along.
That's her. She's a self-taught gardener, and she approaches everything with a sense of curiosity. She's not afraid to just jump in and try something new, even if it means, maybe failing at first.
And that's what's so great about her approach. It's not about being perfect. It's about being willing to experiment and learn from those so-called failures. Would you say that's a key part of this?
I would say so. In fact, the struggle itself, right?
Yeah.
The struggle is valuable. When we're forced to come up with the answers, the solutions, on our own, even if we're wrong, that learning becomes much more ingrained in our minds.
It's making me rethink my whole approach, honestly. It's not about perfection. It's about being curious, engaged, and honestly, a little bit messy.
I like that. And that brings us to another fascinating tool that we can use to really enhance how we encode and retrieve information: mnemonic devices and memory palaces.
This is so interesting. We've talked about desirable difficulties, retrieval practice, spacing, interleaving, variation, even embracing mistakes. It's like a whole new way of thinking about how we learn. But before we wrap up, I want to go back to something you mentioned before: memory palaces and mnemonic devices. I'll be honest, they always seemed kind of like magic tricks to me. How can those actually help us learn, like in real life?
Well, I think a lot of people dismiss those mnemonic devices as, just tricks. But they can be incredibly powerful. They're like tools for organizing and retrieving huge amounts of information. They give us those mental frameworks, kind of like scaffolding, that make it easier for our brains to actually store and recall complex stuff.
So how do they actually work? What's an example?
Let's talk about the memory palace technique for a second. Have you ever noticed how much easier it is to remember the layout of your house or a place that you know really well?
Yeah, like I can walk through my childhood home with my eyes closed, probably.
Exactly. Our brains are just naturally wired to remember that spatial information. So with the memory palace, you take pieces of information you want to remember and you link them with specific spots in a familiar place.
So, like, instead of just trying to memorize a list of facts, I could put those facts in different rooms in my house mentally, of course.
Right. So let's say you're trying to remember the different parts of the brain for your anatomy class, right? You could take the amygdala, which helps process emotions, and link it with your kitchen. You could picture a giant amygdala almond, sitting right there on the counter. Then you go to the hippocampus, which is all about forming memories, and put that in your bedroom. Maybe there's a hippopotamus, like sleeping on your bed or something.
I can see how that would make it stick in your mind, but does that really work? It seems almost too simple.
There's this memory champion, James Patterson, and he found the power of mnemonics kind of by chance, you know. He was a psychology student and came across these techniques as a way to make studying a little less painful.
He wasn't even trying to win memory competitions.
Not at first. He realized it wasn't just about memorizing facts. It actually helped him understand and remember the information way better.
It's not just rote memorization. You're creating connections, organizing things in a way that makes sense to your brain.
Exactly. And anyone can learn how to do this. It just takes a little practice and creativity.
This has been so eye-opening. I'm already thinking about learning in a whole new way. One last thing, though, before we go. Remember learning styles. I was always told I was a visual learner, an auditory learner, all that. Is there anything to that?
You know, it's a really popular belief that we learn best in a certain style, whether it's visual, auditory, kinesthetic. But the research just doesn't back it up. We all have our preferences, sure, but there's no proof that matching how we teach to those preferences actually makes us learn any better.
So all those quizzes I took, total myth.
Let's just say that how we learn is way more complex than that. It's more than just how we like to take in information.
So what does matter then? What makes a difference?
One thing that does seem to matter is structure building. It's how our brains organize information.
Like creating those mental models, those frameworks to make sense of new stuff?
Right. Imagine you're building a house. People who are good at structure building, they're like master architects. They see the whole structure, the blueprints, how it all fits together before they even start. People who aren't as good at structure building, they might need more guidance, a bit more support.
It's not just about how hard we try, it's also about how our brains are wired for organizing information.
Exactly. And that brings us to another important thing, mindset. You familiar with Carol Dweck's work on growth mindset versus fixed mindset?
Absolutely. It's the idea that what we believe about intelligence, whether we think it's fixed or if we can develop it, that can really impact our learning.
And it really does. People who have a growth mindset, they embrace challenges, they don't give up easily, and they see effort as like a path to getting better. People with a fixed mindset, they might avoid challenges, give up more easily, and think effort means they're not good enough.
And just learning about growth mindset can actually help.
Isn't that amazing? We have more control over our learning than we might realize. So, to wrap things up, what are some key things our listeners can take away and use? First, remember that learning is a lifelong process. It's not about being perfect. It's about staying curious, engaged, and pushing yourself. Try things like retrieval practice, spacing, interleaving, variation to work. Work those into how you learn. And most importantly, cultivate that growth mindset. Believe in yourself, and don't be afraid of making mistakes along the way.
I have to say, this has been incredible. I feel like I've learned so much about how my own brain learns how to be a better learner. Thank you for sharing all of this with us.
My pleasure. The more we understand how learning happens, the more we can all unlock our own potential, right?
That's a great place to end. What if we all started looking at mistakes as valuable feedback? They're just stepping stones, right? Thanks for listening, everyone.